Hey guys, tonight, we're crawling under a heavy woolen blanket of snow somewhere in the Viking North. It's quiet outside, too quiet actually. Not the fun kind of quiet like a lazy Saturday morning, but the sort that creeps in through the beams of a longhouse and settles behind your eyes. The wind's howling like a hungry wolf out there, but inside it's just you, the smell of smoke and sheep fat and the slow drip of melting icicles. You're stuck in the dead center of winter, surrounded by axes brooding warriors and an unusually calm board game. Yes, Hnefatafl. Don't worry about pronouncing it correctly, no one else can either. It's basically Viking chess if chess had fewer queens and more suspicious rules that make sense only if you're slightly tipsy on mead. You brave soul are about to trudge into the long, confusing, and hilariously unviolent world of Viking gaming. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because you might nod off in the middle of trying to understand how corner squares work. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in from a fjord or a fluorescent-lit dorm, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little voyage drifts. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's not something people imagine when they think of Vikings. Usually you picture roaring berserkers howling from ships with dragon heads, flinging axes and curses. But after all that raging and pillaging, even the fiercest Norsemen needed to sit down and chill out. What do you do when the sun disappears for 3 months? And you've already recited all your best insults? You play board games, of course. Picture it, a longhouse glowing gold from firelight. The warriors are back from wherever they've been raiding, swaddled in furs and murmuring over wooden cups. On a low table between them lies a game board, scratched roughly into stone or carved into wood. One side has twice as many pieces as the other. No dice, no cards. Just strategy, tension, and the weirdly dignified aim of guiding one tiny king piece to safety. Historians still argue whether these games were designed purely for fun or carried deeper symbolic meaning. But we do know this: the Vikings had several versions of these games grouped under the general name Tafel, which just means table. Simple enough. The most famous is Hnefatafl, which literally translates to fist table, which either refers to the clenched strategic intensity of gameplay or someone really misunderstood what a good game name should sound like. The rules, as best as we can tell, involved one player controlling a king and his 12 defenders surrounded on all sides by 24 attackers. It's asymmetric, unbalanced, weirdly beautiful. Your job as the king is to escape to one of the 4 corners. Your job as the attackers surround the king on all 4 sides to capture him. Sounds easy until you realize that both sides can only move like rooks in chess, in straight lines, no diagonals, and stopping only when they hit something. The pieces are captured by sandwiching them, pinning them between 2 enemies. It's elegant and oddly passive-aggressive. You don't directly strike, you just sort of let the board do the talking. It's like the Viking version of "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." But what's strange is how this calm, quiet gameplay became such a core part of Viking life. They took these boards on ships. They scratched them into rocks. Archaeologists have even found miniature travel versions tucked into burial sites. You know how today's bored travelers play mobile games while waiting for their Uber? Imagine that. But on a longship in the Baltic Sea, carving moves into driftwood while waiting for a storm to pass. And while today's board games often involve fantasy lands or world domination, Hnefatafl was almost minimalist. There were no power-ups, no wildcard moves, no dramatic plot twists. Just cold logic, spatial reasoning, and a little splash of ego. Now here's the fringe part. Some scholars believe the game may have had ritual significance. Like if your king made it to the corner, maybe that wasn't just a win, it was symbolic of escaping fate or cheating death. Remember, these are the same folks who believed in Norn's world serpents and ravens that could tweet prophecies. It's not much of a stretch to imagine they saw more than just entertainment in the king's slow escape across the board. And here's your reality check. If you were playing this game and losing too badly, you might face more than just shame. There are saga snippets, little literary clues, that suggest players occasionally lost their tempers. There's a story where a game ended in a fistfight, another where it escalated to exile. One version even ends with a burning house. Because apparently, if you flipped the board in Viking times, people didn't just roll their eyes. They reached for a sword. And yet, in its purest form, Hnefatafl was a paradox. In a culture obsessed with blood and glory, this game was about restraint. No luck involved, no shouting. Just you, your opponent, and the slow, calculated march of wooden pieces. Imagine how strange that must have felt to live in a world where survival hinged on instinct and chaos, and then to sit down for a game that rewarded patience, foresight, and long-term planning. No wonder they played it obsessively. It was a quiet rebellion against their own stormy lives. And now, as the firelight flickers low and the snow stacks up outside, you sit there cross-legged staring at the board. You're gripping your king piece like it's your own little destiny. And in that moment, it doesn't matter if you've conquered a continent, because if you can't get to that corner square, you've lost. So there you are, hovering over this cold slab of stone with scratchy etchings and pieces made from bone glass, or maybe just carved antler. You're staring at the middle of the board, right where the king sits. He's bigger than the others, maybe just slightly, but always distinct. Surrounded by his defenders, he starts in the center square. The goal, slip away from all the chaos and reach one of the four corners of the board. Just picture that for a moment. Not conquer the enemy, not wipe them out. Just quietly leave. It's possibly the most introverted win condition in all of ancient gaming. The king doesn't attack. He doesn't rage or command thunder. He just wants out. He moves in straight lines like everyone else and relies on his guards to hold the enemy off long enough for him to sneak away, like the last guest trying to escape a party that's gone on too long. And those corners, they're special, sacred even. You can't land on them unless you're the king. That's right. The attackers can't camp there, can't block them, can't even touch them. It's like base in a game of tag-off limits to everyone except the one who needs it most. There's something wonderfully poetic about that. In a culture so soaked in tales of conquest, it's the retreat that wins. Historians still argue whether this reflects a deeper philosophical undercurrent, maybe something to do with fate or the wisdom of choosing survival over stubbornness. Or maybe they just like the irony. And if you're wondering how long a typical game lasted, well, it depends. Some could end in minutes if the king was foolish, or if the attackers coordinated well. Others dragged on. A badly matched game could spiral into a slow war of attrition, with pieces cautiously nudging one another into awkward stalemates, like an ancient Nordic version of office politics. There's one surviving manuscript, just one that gives us a vague glimpse into Tafel rules. It's in Latin, written by a monk who probably didn't even play the game. The rest of our knowledge comes from archaeology and guesswork. So yes, your understanding of Hnefatafl might be just as accurate as a PhD's, probably with better snack breaks. Modern reconstructions suggest that corner escapes made the game inherently unbalanced. The attacker's job is much harder than it looks, despite having more pieces they have to spread out and close off every path to all four corners. It's like trying to trap a mouse in a gymnasium using nothing but polite suggestions and rooks. This imbalance is actually part of the game's charm. Unlike chess, where both players have identical pieces and mirror strategies, Schnöfatafel is a tug-of-war with mismatched ropes. Every move carries different weight depending on your side. And yet, it's still oddly fair, like an artfully staged argument where both people somehow believe they're right. Here's a weird tidbit for you: in some versions, the center square, the king's starting place, was also sacred. Nobody else could occupy it, not even after the king had moved. If a regular piece ended its turn, there it was considered illegal. You'd think that sort of rule would cause arguments. You'd be right. That's the thing: most of the disputes around Schnöfatafel weren't about winning or losing, but about how to interpret the weird little unwritten customs. How exactly do you capture a piece on the edge? What if the king gets pinned against a corner? Does that count as trapped or safe? Entire debates have unfolded over those scenarios. Not during Viking times, mind you, today, among modern Tafel nerds. But still, it says something. In fact, some scholars suspect the rules may have intentionally varied from village to village. So a visiting warrior might confidently challenge a local to a game, only to realize halfway through that corner escape means something entirely different in this fjord. It's like bringing Monopoly to a friend's house and learning their family uses house rules involving goat taxes and triple rent. And yet, the central concept stayed consistent: protect the king. Move him to safety. Don't fight for dominance, fight for escape. That one quiet idea endured across centuries and borders. Even after chess eventually crept in from the south, Schnöfatafel lingered in the north for generations, like the stubborn echo of a colder age. There's something meditative about it. The rhythm of sliding pieces across the board, of calculating traps, and escapes, of holding a dozen moving parts in your head at once. It wasn't a game for the impulsive. It was for the thinker, the planner, the quietly competitive. The one who smiled and said, "Good move," while silently preparing your doom 4 turns ahead. And speaking of quiet thinkers, here's a fun debate still going on among historians. Some believe the king represented the chieftain, the clan's spiritual and political center. Others argue he was just a literal king, maybe even a symbolic Odin figure trying to outrun Ragnarok on a checkered board. Some think the whole thing was just a fun way to kill time before the next raid. But even now, no one's quite sure. It's one of those historical ink blots: the more you stare, the more interpretations emerge. Now imagine playing this in real life. You're crouched near the hearth, eyes flicking across the board. The fire crackles. A cup of sour mead sits untouched beside you. Your opponent, a beardy fellow with an expression like carved oak, leans in. You nudge a defender forward, pretending it's just a casual move, but you know it isn't. You're setting up the perfect escape 3 turns from now, a clean slide to the bottom left corner. He doesn't see it yet. You smile, because in this game, power doesn't roar. It waits, it watches, it slips away when no one's looking. You lean back a little, arms crossed, watching your opponent squint at the board. You've moved your king 2 spaces closer to the corner, and he hasn't noticed. Yet. That's the magic of Schnöfatafel, a game that rewards the quiet manipulator, the unassuming strategist. It's not about brute force. It's about that silky, slow-burn triumph when your opponent finally realizes too late that you've slipped through the cracks. And here's where things get extra weird. The sides aren't just unequal in numbers, they're fundamentally different. This isn't your standard mirrored battlefield like chess, where black and white charge forward in perfect balance. In Tafel, you start with a king and 12 defenders in the center of the board. The enemy, twice as many attackers, spread evenly around the edges. No symmetry, no fairness. just raw strategy tilted like a Viking trying to ice skate on a slope. This setup throws off modern gamers used to symmetrical play. But for the Vikings, that imbalance wasn't a bug, it was the whole point. One player's playing defense, shepherding a single royal piece to freedom. The other is on the offensive, encircling and cornering like a pack of wolves. It's less like chess and more like a Viking horror movie. One side is trying to survive, and the other is playing a slow, methodical game of gotcha. Historians still argue whether this design reflected real-life tactics. Some say it mimics the siege of a chieftain's hall. Others believe it's a metaphor for existential doom, like Ragnarok in miniature. Either way, it speaks volumes about what the Norse found entertaining. Because let's be honest, only a people who lived under constant threat of Stormblade and bad poetry could think this was a relaxing pastime. Now let's talk about etiquette. Weirdly enough, despite the asymmetry and high stakes, the game had its own sense of dignity. You didn't scream checkmate or do a victory lap around the longhouse. You didn't rub it in. Games were serious affairs. Observers might lean in, whispering opinions or sloshing hornfuls of mead, but once the pieces were set, silence. Just the soft scrape of bone against wood, the fire popping now and then, and two minds fencing under furrowed brows. There are hints, mostly in sagas, that some Vikings believed it was dishonorable to take back a move. You commit. You live with it. There's a poetic finality to that. Make your choice, carve it into the board like a rune, and then sit with the consequences. No undo button, no rage quitting, just grim determination and a healthy fear of being laughed at by a 12-year-old shield maiden. And yes, children played too. Tafel wasn't just for warriors or nobles. Archaeological digs have unearthed game pieces in homes campsites and even burial grounds that weren't especially high status. It seems everyone from wide-eyed kids to world-weary scalds could get caught up in the slow, tactical dance of Tafel. That brings us to another quirky little twist. Some variations of the game had different board sizes. Some were as small as 7x7 squares. Others stretched out to 13x13 or even more. That changes everything. A bigger board gives the king more room to run, which means the attackers have to work harder to seal off escape routes. Historians still debate whether certain regions preferred large or small boards, maybe reflecting local styles of strategy or just how much free space you had on your dinner table. Now imagine the complexity here. You're defending the king, trying to guide him toward one of four corners, but you can't leave him unguarded. If the attackers box him in on all four sides, he's done. And they're trying. They're always trying. Creeping in, blocking off roads, cutting off allies. It's like watching a glacier close in on a single tree, one slow inch at a time. Meanwhile, the attackers. They've got their own anxieties. They might have more pieces, but it's not easy being the villain. They have to cooperate, block the king from every angle, coordinate movements, predict patterns. One bad move, and the king slips out, waving a tiny metaphorical cape over his shoulder. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, about a Viking jarl who bet his sword on a game of Tafel. He lost, of course. Not because he was outplayed, but because he was too aggressive. He cornered the king fast, sure, but then overreached, left a single square open. His opponent smiled and glided the king to safety like it was nothing. And that jarl had to hand over a sword with silver filigree and a wolf's head pommel. Brutal, but fair. And that's the core of Tafel. Fairness despite imbalance. Order despite chaos. A strangely calm game born from one of the noisiest cultures in history. It's a little like playing tag on a frozen lake, while quoting epic poetry about shipwrecks and doom. Now we can't leave this section without addressing the modern elephant in the longhouse. No one actually knows the full original rules. Every reconstruction is an educated guess. So if someone tells you you're playing it wrong, just remind them that literally everyone might be. This is a game resurrected from fragments, a Latin note here, a broken board there, and lots of enthusiastic YouTube reenactments involving fake fur and historically inaccurate horned helmets. But that's part of the charm, isn't it? You're not just playing a game. You're stepping into a foggy echo of the past, trying to think like someone who believed the world tree might fall at any moment, and who still found time to carve little pawns out of walrus ivory. So the next time someone tells you Viking life was all blood and thunder, remind them sometimes the most savage thing a Norseman could do was quietly win. You're sitting beside the hearth again, eyes tracing the tiny etchings on the board. But tonight the board is a little different. It's heavier, colder. You run your fingers across the grooves, stone, not wood. And the pieces, they're not carved from driftwood this time. They're shimmering, smoothed glass or knucklebone polished by hands long dead. This is not just a game. This is a relic. A conversation across centuries, still whispering strategy under the weight of soot and time. Some taffel boards were scratched into slate or stone slabs. Others were made of wood, plain pine maybe, or intricately inlaid oak. There are versions carved right into ships. No really etched into decking planks, tucked beside steering posts like a Viking sailor needed something to do between rowing shifts. Imagine a long, brutal sea voyage, and instead of journaling or learning to knit, you whip out a game board embedded in the boat itself. And if the board could be almost anything, the pieces were just as creative. Glass from trade routes, whalebone from the Arctic hunt, antler from reindeer herds, even amber if you were feeling fancy. Some were painted. Some had incised faces, tiny little warriors with blank eyes and stubborn mouths. Others were just simple pegs or rounded nubs. This wasn't about flashiness. It was about playability, and maybe if you squint, a touch of ritual. Historians still argue whether taffel sets were personal belongings or communal ones. Did every warrior have his own pocket-sized set tucked into a leather pouch? Or were they status items displayed like heirlooms and only played during feasts or strategy councils? It's hard to say. The variety of boards found suggests both were true, some simple, others absurdly ornate. One such board was discovered in a grave buried with a wealthy man and an axe, because clearly his afterlife needed both violence and entertainment. There's also that glorious weird crossover with craftsmanship. Some boards are so carefully decorated, they almost seem too delicate to play on. One from the Isle of Lewis, yep, the same island where they found the famous chessmen, had detailed knotwork around the edges, with each square neatly outlined. Who sat there, you wonder? What pieces slid across those neat little tiles? Were the players laughing, or were they the kind of stern, quiet types who just nodded solemnly after each move? One fringe theory suggests some of these boards doubled as ritual items, maybe even divination tools. After all, when your worldview includes frost giants and talking ravens, it's not such a stretch to think a game board could predict your fate. Maybe the path the king took revealed something about your journey. Maybe how you lost said something about the year ahead. There's no proof, of course. But the idea's out there, drifting somewhere between folklore and footnotes. Back to the practical, how did you learn the rules? There weren't rule books, no laminated cheat sheets, no tutorial videos. Everything was passed orally, explained by someone older, someone slower. You probably sat beside a friend cousin or half-drunk uncle as they demonstrated the capture move 3 times in a row, muttering something about, "No, not like that lad, watch again." Then you tried. Then you failed. Then you watched again. It also meant that rules could evolve. One village might play with corner escape, another might use edge squares. In some places, the king had to be surrounded on all four sides. In others, 3 was enough if one was a special square. It was a beautiful mess, regional dialects of strategy, if you will. And yes, there were house rules. Of course there were. Imagine a longhouse where the older generation insists the king can leap like a rook in chess, and the younger ones say that's ridiculous. You'd end up with the Viking equivalent of, "No, my dad says landing on free parking gets you all the tax money." This kind of messy consistency is half the reason modern historians need spreadsheets just to compare TAFL variants. There's even a debate over whether players used timers or well-time constraints. Some believe that during feasts or festivals, TAFL matches had to be brisk, maybe because everyone was waiting their turn. Others argue the best games took hours. It's a toss-up between festive quickfire matches and brooding candlelit duels that lasted until someone's goat wandered off. And in the middle of all this sits the board. Flat, silent, waiting. There's something charming about how tactile it all was. No screens, no batteries, no flashy animations. Just the scratch of bone against stone, the creak of wood under elbows, the occasional grunt of disappointment when a move backfired. The game existed in real space. You touched it. You felt its weight. Some sets were light and portable, others heavy enough to double as a weapon if you lost badly enough. All of them held stories. Let's not forget the travel boards, folding wooden pieces, hinged boxes, even game cloths painted with ink that could be rolled up and stashed in a saddlebag. That's right. Vikings had travel versions of TAFL, kind of like ancient Game Boys, minus the sound effects, and plus a lot more whale vertebrae. And this wasn't just a nobleman's hobby. As far as we can tell, the game crossed class lines. Farmers played, traders played, warriors played. It wasn't just about status, it was about wits. If you were clever enough to protect your king and quick enough to trap your opponent, you earned respect. Maybe even a second helping of stew. Now picture this: 2 players hunched over a board carved into a ship's deck, the ocean sloshing just beyond the oars. They don't speak. They don't need to. One moves a piece forward. The other responds. It's a silent story unfolding in moves and counter-moves, each click of bone echoing slightly against the hull. A game played not just to pass time, but maybe to practice the patience, the foresight, and the calm it takes to survive a storm. Let's talk about what wasn't there. No dice, that's right. Hnefatafl and its cousins, unlike many games from the Roman or Egyptian worlds, had absolutely zero interest in the element of chance. There were no little cubes to roll, no bones to cast, no numbered sticks to jiggle in a pouch. And for a culture that practically worshipped fate, Norns weaving destinies, omens carved in tree bark, you'd think the Vikings would love dice. But nope, TAFL was about control. Pure, slow-burn strategy. Every move came from your mind. No luck, no fate, no maybe I'll get a 6. You had to think, to plan, to outmaneuver. It's the opposite of gambling. In a world full of chaos, TAFL gave you a tiny square of order, predictable, manageable order. Now dice did exist in Viking times. Archaeologists have found them carved from bonewood antler, sometimes even beautifully made with painted dots or runes. But they were mostly for drinking games, betting, or imported pastimes. TAFL was proudly, stubbornly, defiantly dice-free, like a Viking teenager who refused to join the Roman board game trend. Historians still argue whether this was philosophical or just practical. Did the Vikings intentionally strip out randomness to create a test of pure will? Or did they simply find dice annoying to use on bumpy longhouse floors? Either way, it makes TAFL oddly modern, more like chess, or Go, than ancient backgammon. Here's a fringe theory for you. Some scholars believe the absence of dice was meant to contrast human strategy with divine fate. In other words, Tafel was your chance to outwit your opponent with no gods allowed. No rolling the bones and hoping Odin was in a good mood. Just two minds locked in a slow, unblinking duel over a hand-carved grid. And of course, removing chance doesn't mean removing drama. If anything, it makes it more intense. Because when you lose, you really lose. No blaming the dice. No muttering about bad luck. Just your own hubris spiraling out in four directions, leaving your king surrounded by smug little glass attackers. Now, if you were feeling particularly spicy, you could play for stakes. There's scattered evidence that Tafel matches sometimes involved betting items, favors, maybe even a small flock of goats if things got wild. But the game itself didn't encourage it. No jackpots, no dice rolls, just honor skill and bragging rights. There's even an Icelandic saga where a player throws a tantrum mid-game not because he lost, but because he moved wrong. He knew it. Everyone else knew it. He smacked the table, cursed the board, and stormed off. A dramatic Viking version of flipping the Monopoly board and walking into the snow. Still, the absence of dice didn't mean the game lacked unpredictability. Far from it. Every move opened up possibilities, new traps, clever escapes, elegant feints. A defender might sacrifice himself to give the king a clear path. An attacker might let a piece fall to lure the king into a false sense of security. It's less roll and react, and more move and manipulate. One 10th century carving even seems to show a Tafel game being played mid-journey, right on the deck of a ship in the cramped corner behind the cargo hold. No dice. Just two players hunched close, probably arguing in low voices about whether the king was allowed to pass through the central square twice in one turn. He wasn't. Probably. Let's talk about pacing for a moment. Tafel wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. This wasn't the kind of game you crammed into 10 minutes before dinner. It could stretch for hours, especially between evenly matched players. One wrong move might take 5 turns to unravel. One brilliant trap might take 10 to spring. That's part of the appeal. It gave players time to think, to stew, to sip their drink, glance at the fire, and smirk across the board. The absence of chance meant that every moment mattered. Every square had meaning. You didn't wait for luck, you built your own. And you felt it too. Not just in your head, but in your hands. Moving a piece wasn't just mechanical. It was tactile, deliberate. You slid it across the stone or wood, leaving behind a tiny trail of intent. A promise, a challenge. Like saying your move, but with bone instead of words. It's funny, isn't it? We're so used to randomness in games today. Loot boxes, card draws, spinning wheels. Tafel reminds us what it's like to play without a safety net. No second chances, no lucky saves. Just the clean, brutal elegance of a game where you are the only variable. There's a quiet thrill in that. In knowing your opponent can't pull off a comeback because of some lucky roll. If they beat you, it's because they saw something you didn't. And if you win, it's because you earned it, not because the gods threw you a bone. Now picture this, it's late. The fire's gone low. The board sits between you and your opponent. You've both been playing for over an hour. The king is 2 spaces from freedom. You can feel the tension in the room. No one speaks. You move your last defender. Your opponent's eyes widen. They see the trap, but too late. No shouting, just the soft, satisfying click of a king piece reaching the corner square. And the silence that follows, stretched long and thin like a winter night just before the thaw. The board's quiet again. The last piece moved. The final strategy executed, but someone's frowning. Not because they lost, not exactly. It's more complicated than that. There's been a disagreement again about the rules. Was that capture legal? Could the king really escape through that square? One player swears it's allowed. The other narrows their eyes. There's a long silence, then a grunt, then a quiet, bitter, "Your rules are wrong." Here's the thing about Viking board games: they were calm, sure, but only mostly calm. Tafel had no formal manual, no laminated rule set or official adjudicator in a striped tunic. The rules lived in memory, in habit, in tradition. And sometimes, well, sometimes they disagreed. And when two heavily armed players both thought they were right, things could go sideways. Historians still argue whether Hnefatafl was ever the cause of actual brawls, but sagas tell stories. Colorful, exaggerated, whispery stories that feel just real enough to make you raise an eyebrow. There's one tale in the Icelandic Grettir's saga where a man loses a Tafel match and then loses his temper, and his friend, and arguably his standing in the village. The fight escalates from a rules debate to a full-blown duel in the snow, all because of a single disputed move. Imagine that. Chess rage, but with axes. And then there's the peculiar case of exile. In another saga, a traveler is banished from the hall after accusing his host of cheating. It wasn't even clear whether cheating had occurred. It might have just been a misremembered house rule. But the insult itself was apparently worse than anything the attacker did on the board. You could mess up strategy, but don't mess up hospitality. Or as one scholar put it, in Viking games, honor matters more than the king. That might sound dramatic, but consider the context. A Tafel match wasn't just a game, it was a performance, a social dance, sometimes even a low-key power play. If you were playing in a longhouse filled with warriors, it mattered how you lost. Did you grumble, flip the board, accuse someone of rule bending? Or did you nod, stoically say good game, and vow silent revenge next Yule? Weirdly, some modern Tafel tournaments, yes, they exist, still echo this. There's a strange reverence around the board, an unspoken code of courtesy. Trash talk is minimal. Disputes are handled like diplomatic meetings. Pardon me, but I believe your piece cannot pass through the center square unless it's polite, it's tense, it's wonderfully passive-aggressive. Of course, not every Viking took the rules so seriously. Some were clearly just there to pass the time, to relax with a drink, and try not to fall asleep before the hearth embers died. There's evidence of Tafel boards scratched into tavern tables, even carved casually into the benches of meeting halls. Quick matches, fast hands, rough pieces, probably accompanied by laughter mead, and that one guy who insisted he definitely remembered the rule about corner captures he didn't. But even in these more relaxed settings, the game had teeth. You didn't accuse someone of cheating unless you were prepared to back it up. With words, usually. Occasionally with fists. Maybe once in a while with steel. One particularly quirky piece of archaeological evidence comes from a site in York, Viking York, that is where a Tafel piece was found buried near what appeared to be the remains of a half-collapsed longhouse wall. The piece was snapped clean in half. Some suggest it was merely lost and broken over time. Others whisper about a game gone wrong, a dispute, a shove, a board flipped and slammed into the ground. Is it too dramatic? Maybe is it too perfect? Also, yes. And then there are the Tafel insults. Oh yes, the sagas occasionally mention board game-specific jabs. They're subtle, but they're there. Things like your king flees faster than a sheep from thunder, or even Loki wouldn't defend that move. These weren't just casual burns. They were surgical, aimed precisely at the pride of the player. More poetry than profanity, because in the Viking world, even your insults had to have a little flair. One line from a preserved poem compares a poor Taffel strategy to a bad harvest. Not just embarrassing, but deeply inconvenient. Because losing was bad, but losing badly, that could follow you for seasons. Maybe even get turned into a verse. And once someone sang about your shame, good luck. It's worth remembering, too, that in small, tightly knit communities, reputation mattered more than gold. And games like Taffel were one of the few peaceful ways to earn or lose that reputation. Winning gracefully could get you noticed. Losing gracefully could get you respected. Losing poorly might get you remembered, but not in the way you wanted. That's why the game had this bizarre, beautiful tension, not just on the board, but around it. Every match was a little stage play, a quiet duel, a way of saying I'm clever without ever raising your voice. And yes, now and then, it got messy. Imagine the final moments of one of these matches. You're standing now, both of you. The last few pieces slide into place. Your king is trapped. You miscalculated. You frown. Your opponent raises an eyebrow. Then, a pause. You nod, accepting defeat. But your hand lingers on the board, just for a second. And your opponent watches, waiting. Everyone in the longhouse holds their breath. Because in that moment, the wrong word could mean insult. The wrong tone, dishonor. But the right gesture. A hand offered a smile, a joke that could mean the beginning of a friendship, or the end of a rivalry, or at the very least, the start of a rematch. And all of it resting on a game that doesn't even have dice. You're sitting in a different hall now. It smells like salted fish and damp wool. The roof is low, the walls carved with swirling knotwork, and the smoke hole is doing a very bad job of actually getting rid of the smoke. But no one minds. A feast is wrapping up. Someone just tried to rhyme seal blubber with thunder, and now, in the after-dinner lull, a Taffel board appears, pulled from a shelf, unwrapped from a bit of oiled leather, and plunked onto the table between two rivals who suddenly look very awake. That's the thing about Hnefatafl, it wasn't just a game. It was a performance. And sometimes it was entertainment for an audience. Historians still argue whether Taffel was formally used in feasts or just a casual post-meal hobby. But the sagas are clear these games were often public, observed, watched like a drama. People commented on moves, whispered about strategies, maybe even placed informal bets. And when the players were especially clever or especially petty, it became a kind of intellectual sport. One move ahead of the king, a cheer. A clever trap, a low, impressed murmur. A mistake, sharp, inhaling through teeth, and someone muttering, well, that's a shame. Not unlike modern chess commentary if your chessboard were sitting between a meat spit and someone snoring into their beard. And if the players were rivals off the board. Well, the drama practically wrote itself. There's a tale, half legend, half wishful memory about two brothers who played Taffel during every feast. They never spoke outside the game, wouldn't work together, wouldn't even eat together. But once the board came out, total concentration, silent nods, nimble fingers moving antler pieces. For a few minutes, they communicated in strategy alone. Then the game would end. One would nod, the other would scowl, and they'd return to ignoring each other completely. Game night Viking style. But not everyone was a master strategist. Taffel was a game you could watch long before you understood it. Children would sit beside the fire, eyes wide, trying to follow the rhythms. Women played too, especially in Norse settlements like Greenland and the Orkneys, where there are hints that Taffel may have been taught to both boys and girls as a test of mental sharpness. No swords required, just wits. And in those moments, Those feast night face-offs or quiet afternoon matches, something else would surface teaching. See, this game had layers. The more you played, the more you saw. Beginners would charge their attackers straight at the king like a ram into a wall. Experienced players knew better. They'd maneuver, lure, wait for a mistake. It wasn't just about being aggressive, it was about being subtle, like putting a fox on the board and waiting for someone to mistake it for a chicken. So veterans would coach the younger ones. Don't chase, control, or if you can't win, delay. Make them work for it. These weren't just game tips. They were little philosophies snuck in under the guise of strategy, patience, cunning, calm. One quirky tidbit: some modern reenactors swear that certain historical variants had audience pieces, decorative tokens placed beside the board to represent observers like little Viking emoji. You couldn't move them. You couldn't interact with them. They were just there, a reminder that in Tafel someone was always watching. No one can prove this, but it's an adorably specific idea. And who were these observers? Not just friends, not just family, sometimes important guests, maybe even potential allies. Imagine you're trying to impress a visiting Jarl. Sure, you could brag about your livestock or your beautifully thatched roof, but wouldn't it be more elegant to sit down and win gracefully at Tafel? It's like modern networking, only with more animal pelts and fewer LinkedIn profiles. Of course, not every public match went well. There were moments recorded only in vague anecdotes where one player completely collapsed. The king was trapped in 6 moves. Defenders panicked. The entire audience winced like someone had just dropped a meat pie face down on the floor. Losing was one thing. Losing publicly, that stung. And here's where it gets fascinating: the concept of honor through intellect. In Viking society, glory usually came from combat, from bravery, blade work, and boldness. But Tafel carved out this weird little side alley of prestige for the brainy types. If you could win repeatedly against strong opponents and do it without showboating, people noticed, people respected it. One saga, brief and strange, mentions a chieftain who chose his messenger not based on physical strength, but on Tafel skill. He can read the board, the chieftain reportedly said. So he'll read a room. That's right. Good Tafel players were seen as socially sharp, observant, strategic not just in games but in life. Which raises the question, was Tafel just a game? Or was it training? Modern scholars still debate this. Some argue it was just idle fun. Others think it trained young Norse folk in battlefield tactics, coordination, defense feints. Some even claim that Tafel was used to teach leadership. The king must rely on his defenders. He can't win alone. He escapes through planning, not force. Whatever the truth, the result was, the same people gathered, watched, learned. The game was a centerpiece, a cultural hearthstone, and occasionally a tool. So the next time you see a Viking scene in a movie, all roaring and mead and axe throwing, just imagine a quieter moment. 2 people hunched over a little board, firelight glinting on polished glass, one hand slowly reaching toward a corner square, and the rest of the hall leaning in breath held. No swords, no shouting, just the sound of strategy unfolding. By now you're familiar with the rhythm, the soft scrape of bone on board, the narrow eyes, the thoughtful pause, the little smirk when someone thinks they're 2 moves ahead. You're deep into the world of Tafel. But here's the thing, it didn't stay Tafel. Like all good games, it changed. It wandered. It picked up quirks along the way, sometimes improving, sometimes just getting weirder. This is the part where the game gets on a longship and sails south. The earliest versions of Tafel were homegrown, born in Scandinavia, spread by raiders, settlers, and traders. But as the Viking world expanded, crossing into the British Isles, Ireland, even parts of Russia, the game had to adapt. and boy did it. Historians still argue whether all these versions were truly Tafel or if they started blending with other traditions. But what's clear is that Tafel morphed. It picked up different names, different board sizes, different wind conditions. It became Ardrei in Ireland, Alea Evangelii in Anglo-Saxon England, even Tablet in Lapland, played by the Sami well into the 1700s. And yes, that last version is the one that gave Tafel nerds the biggest headache. Let's start with Tablet, because honestly, it's kind of hilarious. In the 18th century, a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus, yes, the same guy who invented the modern system of naming plants, took a trip up north. Alongside noting down mosses and snow patterns, he recorded a local game that involved a king in the center, surrounded by defenders, trying to escape from attackers. Sound familiar? He wrote down the rules, or tried to. His notes were in Latin, the translation was sloppy. He didn't actually play the game. He just watched a few rounds and scribbled frantically while cold and possibly very bored. The result, a confusing set of directions that historians have spent centuries arguing over like it's the Rosetta Stone of board games. Was Tablet just a surviving form of Tafel, or something new with similar roots? Did Linnaeus get the win condition right? Did he flip the attacker and defender roles by mistake? No one can agree. It's like trying to reconstruct a cake recipe based on one blurry photo and someone's grandmother yelling in another room. Meanwhile, over in Ireland, the game became Ard, Rai, High King. Same basic idea, a king in the middle, attackers all around. But now the board was smaller, 7-7, and the king had a tougher time escaping. He could still win by reaching a corner, but now the defenders had fewer pieces. Some historians believe this version made the game harder, tenser, like a siege in miniature with odds stacked against you. Then you have Alea Evangelii, which, well, buckle up. It shows up in an Anglo-Saxon manuscript from the 12th century. It includes a giant 18 board full of Christian symbolism. The name means Game of the Gospels. Yep, Gospels. Some monk possibly hopped up on theological excitement and no sleep decided Tafel needed a biblical remix. The king represents Christ. The attackers are the pagans. The defenders are the apostles. The goal guide the divine figure to safety, obviously. Forget Thor, this version had a halo and a moral. And also no actual rules survived. Just the board design full of symbolic groupings and probably zero playability. It's a little like taking Call of Duty and turning it into a stained glass window. Still, all these mutations tell us something important. Tafel wasn't static. It traveled. It adapted. Wherever it landed, people changed the rules a bit to fit their own tastes or their own theology. But they kept the heart of it, asymmetric sides, the lone king, the escape. Except, one day it stopped. Somewhere between the 11th and 13th centuries, Tafel started to disappear. In its place came a newer game, shinier, flashier, faster. A game that had royalty and pawns, knights and queens, and most importantly, balance. You guessed it. Chess. Imported from the Islamic world through Spain, chess swept through Europe like wildfire. It had all the things Tafel lacked: formal rules, universal boards, and mirrored sides. It was symmetrical, predictable, easier to teach, easier to standardize, and arguably, at least in the eyes of medieval nobility, more elegant. Historians still debate whether chess was better than Tafel, but in the eyes of the medieval upper class, it definitely looked fancier. It had exotic origins. It had bishops. It had queens who could fly across the board. Tafel, by contrast, had a king who could barely crawl his way to the corner and a bunch of defenders whose best move was, "Please don't die yet." So Tafel faded, not everywhere and not all at once. It lingered in corners of Scandinavia, in pockets of rural Scotland, in the Sami North. But by the 1300s, its golden age was over, and yet it survived. in pieces, in whispers, in boards buried with bones, in sagas half remembered. And then centuries later, people started digging it up again. Scholars, gamers, reenactors, weirdly passionate YouTubers. They reconstructed it, reimagined it, wrote rule books, started tournaments. Tafel got a second life. Now you can buy hand-carved sets online. You can play apps on your phone. You can challenge strangers on obscure message boards and lose to someone named Bone King 97 who absolutely knows more than you. Tafel is back, and honestly, it's thriving. It's no longer a Viking pastime. It's a resurrection, and that in a strange and quiet way might be the most Tafel move of all. The wind howls outside now, a sound not unlike the sea gnawing at the edges of a longship. You're still at the board fingertips hovering over smooth, worn squares. But now you're not alone. There's a quiet crowd around you, imaginary of course, centuries of players peering over your shoulder. A monk in Wessex, a Sami herder near the Arctic Circle, a boy on a fjord. All playing the same game? Almost. Because Tafel, unlike its more famous cousin chess, never stopped evolving. It didn't fossilize. It fragmented. It branched and warped like a tree under wind, leaving dozens of strange and specific variants behind. Each little version offers a new flavor of frustration. Let's dip into some of the more obscure ones. First, there's Talbjund, or table game reportedly played in parts of Wales. We don't have much on it, just some fragmentary mentions and a drawing or two. But the name hints at Tafel DNA. Historians still debate whether it was its own creature or a cousin that picked up different habits in the Celtic hills. Some believe it borrowed rules from Roman board games that lingered after the empire's collapse. Others think it was just Hnefatafel in a very convincing disguise. Then there's Brandub, the Irish Black Raven game. Smaller board, fewer pieces, high stakes. Brandub's king escapes via specific corner squares, often marked with little raven symbols. These weren't just any squares, they were sacred. And the name Black Raven was likely a reference to Odin himself, who, let's not forget, sent 2 ravens to spy on the world each day. In Brandub, the king doesn't just flee, he flies. And here's where it gets weird. Some scholars believe that players in certain regions assigned their pieces personalities. Not names exactly, but roles. The king might be a chieftain or even a god. The defenders, loyal clansmen. The attackers, foreign invaders, or sometimes fate itself. This wasn't just strategy, it was storytelling. You weren't moving tokens. You were reenacting a legend in miniature. Every match a myth. Every capture a poem. It's not so far-fetched. Remember, this was a culture built on oral tradition. Skalds turned every conflict into a saga. Even a mundane game could echo something larger. The king doesn't just escape. He returns. He rebuilds. He brings balance. That's why in some late variants, winning wasn't even about the king reaching the corner. It was about surviving a certain number of turns, or about defeating the attackers completely. Historians still argue whether this marked a shift in values from flight to fight, from escape to endurance. The game mirrored the world, and in a world that was growing colder, harsher, less mythic. Sometimes it was enough just to last. Even the boards changed shape. A few versions weren't square, they were cross-shaped. Think of it a central axis, the king in the middle paths, leading outward in 4 directions, like compass points or tree limbs. Was it decorative, symbolic, a theological nod from a Christianized Viking generation? No one knows for sure. But the image lingers a game where the board itself radiates purpose. And then there's the lost variant. We don't know what it was called. Only that it shows up in a footnote in a 14th century Scandinavian legal text. Something about not wagering over royal escape games played in reverse. In reverse? What did that mean? Was the king trying not to escape? Were the attackers defending? Was it a satire, a puzzle, a prank? Modern Tafl fans call it Mirror Tafl, and yes, people have tried to recreate it. Some even run annual joke tournaments where the rules change each round. It's delightfully chaotic, and also very on-brand for a game that refuses to be pinned down. But even with all this variation, one thing never changes: the silence. Tafl isn't loud. It doesn't yell for attention. It hums, it broods, it waits. You can hear it in the quiet tension between moves, in the way a good player doesn't speak, just watches, in the flicker of firelight on a glass piece as it slides one square closer to freedom. One reenactor once said Tafl felt like playing a poem made of steps. You move, you breathe, you wait. The game unfolds, not with explosions, but with whispers. And that's the real magic, isn't it? Not just the pieces or the rules or the hand-carved boards, but the mood it creates. The atmosphere, that calm, eerie space where time slows down and every square is a question. Who will guard the king? Who will fall? What will be remembered? Because even now, centuries after it fell out of fashion, Tafl still casts a shadow. It slips into video games, inspires fantasy novels, shows up in unexpected corners of popular culture. Looking at UTV dramas with suspiciously Scandinavian board game props. It's never quite gone. It just waits. And if you find yourself one quiet evening staring down at a 13x13 grid hand hovering over a smooth wooden king, you might just feel them again. All those players, watching, not judging, just remembering. You're still awake somehow. The game keeps unfolding in your mind, even with your eyes half-lidded. There's something hypnotic about it. Maybe it's the repetition, maybe the symmetry. Or maybe it's because Tafl isn't just a pastime. It's a worldview disguised as a tabletop hobby. Because when you look closely, the king's journey across the board starts to feel like a metaphor. Not just for power, but for survival, for balance, for how you navigate through pressure without crumbling, without swords, without shouting, just square after deliberate square. Now here's something that might surprise you. Hnefatafl wasn't the only board game in the Viking world. It was the most famous, sure. But it had competition games that came before games that sat beside it, and games that maybe even influenced it. Let's peek into that broader context. First up, Nine Men's Morris, a game older than the Vikings, but still widely played in Northern Europe during their era. It involved placing and moving pieces to form lines of 3, and every time you completed a line, you got to remove one of your opponent's pieces. Simple, brutal, surprisingly addictive. Boards for Nine Men's Morris have been found carved into Roman stone's monastery steps, even the wooden beams of Viking homes. And in some cases, they're found next to Tafl boards on the same slab. A dual game platform, if you will. Like a Game Boy with 2 cartridges, one for escape and strategy, the other for pure abstract takedown. Historians still argue whether these games were connected or just cohabiting out of convenience. Did players switch between them in a single sitting? Was one seen as more grown-up or more holy? Nobody's sure. But it's clear that Vikings didn't just crave stories, they craved structure, systems, a place where the world made sense even if only for 15 quiet minutes. Another lesser-known game doob, a dice and board hybrid that might have come from contact with the Celtic world. A few sources reference it. No surviving boards, just whispers and reconstructed rules. But it suggests that some Vikings did experiment with luck-based games, just not as reverently. Still, Tafl stayed unique in its calm rigidity. No randomness, no excuses. There's something quietly subversive about that. especially in a culture so full of chaos. Viking life wasn't exactly serene. Storms, raids, hard winters, short tempers. And yet this was the game they returned to. Not something explosive, but something patient. A quiet grid where everything could be known, anticipated, controlled. Even the symmetry of the board tells you something. 4 sides, equal reach. A king in the middle like a heartbeat trying to get out. There's no real fantasy here, no dragons or magic runes. But somehow it feels epic anyway. And here's a fringe idea for you. Some scholars believe that Tafel boards mirrored sacred geography. That the layout echoed ancient Norse cosmology, Midgard in the center, surrounded by hostile realms. The king isn't just a ruler. He's a human soul trying to flee encroaching darkness. A myth played in miniature. A theology with game pieces. There's no hard proof for this. No saga explicitly states the king represents the psyche navigating existential threat. But look at it. Really look. It's not just tactical, it's spiritual. There's something symbolic about always being under siege, always relying on the loyalty of your circle, always looking for a way out. That doesn't involve force, but timing. And in a broader sense, Tafel trains something modern minds rarely practice losing well. Because you will lose. This isn't a beginner's game. You'll misjudge distances. You'll overlook a trap. You'll send your king skittering into a perfect ambush, watched by 4 bone-faced attackers who've been waiting patiently. And when that happens, you sit back, you breathe, and you say again. In the saga's defeat in Tafel isn't dishonorable. Losing calmly is a virtue. It shows composure, humility, that rare ability to observe your own failure and not take it personally. Try saying that about a modern board game without flipping a table. Which makes you wonder, was Tafel used not just to entertain, but to train temperament? Picture a young warrior-to-be full of bravado, learning patience by getting humiliated on a game board by a quiet aunt or an unamused older sibling. Imagine chieftains watching candidates, not just for brute strength, but for how they handled a quiet, grinding loss, how they planned, how they responded when things fell apart. And here's another strange fact. In some grave finds, Tafel boards are discovered alongside weapons and cooking tools. Sword, cauldron, strategy game, the full spectrum of Viking life, fight, feed, think, the essentials for both war and peace. One such burial found in Denmark included a nearly complete Tafel set, stone, board, glass pieces, even a carved horn box to hold them. The deceased, likely a nobleman, a man of stature, possibly a leader, someone who needed to keep his mind as sharp as his blade. It's a lovely image, isn't it? That a strategy game could be considered important enough to carry into the afterlife. Not gold, not trophies. This, a grid, a game. A final reminder that even beyond the grave, he was still planning his next move. And maybe you're not a Viking warlord. Maybe you'll never wield a broadsword or command a longship. But you can still sit at the board. You can still feel that quiet pull of structure, the calming click of bone on wood. You can still lose, learn, reset. 100 quiet lessons tucked inside a game that has survived everything except forgetting. It's a little colder now. The fire's burned lower. Maybe you're wrapped up in something soft, blanket, hoodie, old quilt with corners curled like dry parchment. Either way, the board is still there in your mind. You reach for another piece, slide it one space, pause. Because you've just realized something odd. There are no women on the board. Not explicitly, anyway. No queens, no priestesses, no carved Valkyries with spears of bone. Just a king, defenders, attackers, male-coded by default. Or are they, see Hanifa Tafel doesn't name its pieces. It doesn't assign gender roles or personal identities. that's something we bring in. And historians still argue whether the game was seen as masculine or if that's just modern bias poking through the saga mist. Because here's the twist. There's a surprising amount of evidence that Viking women did play Tafel. And not just as spectators, as strategists. Archaeologists have found Tafel sets in female graves, real ones, important ones, not side burials or child burials, but full-on high-status interments. In some cases, the boards were laid next to jewelry or weaving tools. In others, they sat at the center, prominent, maybe even prized. One famous grave in Birka, Sweden, revealed a woman buried with weapons and a tafelboard. For a while, scholars assumed it must have been a man until DNA evidence said otherwise. The discovery made headlines, and for good reason. Because this wasn't a housewife playing a little game before bedtime. This was someone powerful. A leader, a gamer, possibly a general. And then you have the sagas. Oh, the sagas. In Gisli's saga, a woman named Aud is shown besting her male relatives at board games. It's a throwaway line, barely explained, but the tone is clear, she's sharp. No one messes with her. She plays silently, effectively, and leaves the men blinking at the board. A quiet burn Viking style. Historians still debate how widespread female play actually was. Was it reserved for noble women? Was it considered unfeminine to win too easily? Or did the rules of the board override the roles of the world outside it? It's hard to say. Viking culture was complex. Women could own property, they could divorce, they could sail, they could govern in some regions, and clearly some of them could really play Tafel. There's also the possibility, fringe but tantalizing, that some Tafel variants had named or themed pieces. A few broken boards recovered from the Hebrides and Orkney Islands show central pieces with intricate knotwork and stylized hair that to some eyes looks decidedly not masculine. Could these have been queens, priestesses, embodiments of fate? No one agrees, but the idea lingers like wood smoke. In fact, the most consistently named piece across all variants is simply the king. Not the player, not the center, the king. It reflects the structure of the world at the time, hierarchical, patriarchal, symbolic. But it also raises the question, if the king is cornered and the board is silent, who's really in control? Because in practice, the power lies with the player, not the piece. You sitting at the edge of firelight, hands curled around a game that's more mind than material. You could call the king anything. You could imagine them as anyone. Your own avatar, your own journey, your own escape. It's one of the strange modern charms of Tafel. It's abstract. The lack of lore lets you insert your own. A mother defending her child. A chieftain surrounded by fate. A poet encircled by deadlines. Relatable. And this brings us to another under-discussed part of Tafel history, the emotional layer. People didn't just play to win. They played to feel, to process, sometimes to mourn. There's an Old Norse poem, fragmentary, worn with time, that describes a widow playing Tafel alone. The imagery is soft and strange. Her fingers brush the empty squares. Her eyes stay fixed on the board long after the final move. Scholars interpret it as symbolic grief, a way of showing how the game helps her map out loss, turn chaos into grid, turn absence into order. And isn't that what we do with games even now? We sit down when we need structure, when the world spins too fast, when things go sideways and we want something, anything we can control. A board, a few rules, a goal. The irony, of course, is that Tafel is about escaping. The king doesn't conquer. He doesn't convert enemies or flip them to allies. He just flees, strategically, calmly, wisely. Some see this as a weakness, but to others it's beautiful. A game where the noblest piece survives not by domination, but by outmaneuvering the threat. by being clever, by being composed. And so yes, maybe women played Tafel. Maybe they played it well. Maybe they played it when they weren't allowed to fight, or weren't allowed to lead, or weren't allowed to speak. Because at the board, all that falls away. No one shouts. No one lunges. The only voice is movement. A hand moves a piece. Another responds. And a whole universe shifts in silence. Let's pause a moment and take stock. You've followed the king across the board, from firelit feast halls to cold northern graves. You've played through strategy and symbolism, through arguments and archaeology, and still somehow it feels like there's more. Because there is. Because Tafel, this deceptively quiet little game, doesn't just tell us how Vikings played, it tells us how they thought. See, in a world of swirling myth and brutal winters, the Tafel board offered something rare: predictability. Each square had rules. Every piece had boundaries. Even the chaos of battle became a puzzle to solve. It's like someone took the panic of a raid and pressed it into grid lines, said, "Here, this is how you survive it." Historians still argue whether Tafel influenced Viking leadership styles or simply reflected them. But it's tempting to look at the culture of the Longhouse, full of complex alliances, shifting loyalties, blood feuds, and honor debts, and see it all distilled in one small, portable simulation. Think about it. The king can't win alone. He needs protection. But his defenders are vulnerable, outnumbered, and cornered from the start. It's not enough to charge forward. They have to coordinate, time their moves, cover escape routes, sacrifice when necessary. It's not a game of domination. It's a game of survival through community. Now imagine a chieftain teaching this to his children, not with lectures, but by letting them lose. Over and over again, until they stop thinking like individuals and start thinking like a team. The Tafel board becomes a blueprint for ruling disguised as after-dinner fun. The king learns not to command, but to trust. And that's surprisingly modern. It's also remarkably portable. Vikings didn't settle in one place. They moved. Which meant Tafel had to be compact. Rollable boards, lightweight pieces. Some were made of bone antler or clay materials easy to replace if lost. Others found in wealthier burials were polished glass or ivory. These weren't just tokens. They were treasures, status symbols, carried from camp to camp, ship to shore. One quirky tidbit: some Tafel sets have been found with spare kings, not spare defenders, not extra attackers, just backups for the central piece. Why? Because if your king cracked or vanished in the snow, your game was pointless. No king, no contest. It's like trying to play Monopoly with no money and one house rule that says everyone has to be nice. Just doesn't work. In a sense, the king piece wasn't just part of the game. It was the anchor. Some reenactors say they feel different when they hold it. Not because it's stronger or heavier, but because it means something. You don't just place it, you position it. Carefully. As though it's aware. As though it knows the odds. And maybe it does. Because here's the other strange layer: Tafel feels alive. Not literally. But after hours of play, real or imagined, you start seeing rhythms in the board. Patterns, personalities. The defenders start feeling noble, the attackers relentless. The king. A little panicked, but still composed. Still scanning, still hoping. There's a kind of heartbeat in the gameplay. Slow at first, then faster, then the endgame hits, and suddenly your hands move quicker. The escape is near, or the trap, or the stalemate. You lose track of time. That's the point, isn't it? Tafel, like many ancient pastimes, isn't just about distraction. It's about altering your perception, of minutes, of pressure, of yourself. In a time when life was unpredictable, the game offered structure. In a world full of noisy myths, it was a quiet thinking space. And even now, modern players report the same sensation. They'll boot up an app or lay out a reproduction board or click through an online match, and by move 3, the world fades. The clicks, the timers, the comments gone. It's just you, the pieces, and a decision. Sometimes the decision is bad. You let the king wander too far from his defenders. You misjudge the spacing. You fall into a baited cross pattern and mutter, "Ugh, classic blunder," like someone overheard you. But then you reset. And again and again. The victory condition is simple: get the king to the corner. But the victory feeling, that's trickier. It doesn't come with gloating. There are no trumpets. Just a slow smile, a sigh, a whispered, "That was close." And sometimes the best wins are the ones you almost lost. The ones where your king slipped through with one square to spare because two defenders worked together just long enough to crack a path. That's the other quiet lesson Tafel teaches: trust the small moves. Nothing flashy, just quiet control, just patience, just endurance until the moment appears, and then you take it. One piece forward, one square left, the path opens, the king slides free. Checkmate, no. There's no check, no mate, just escape, just breath, just silence. The board is starting to blur now, just lines and shadows, and that one little piece, the king quietly waiting in the center. You've come far with him, but before we guide him to one final square, there's something strange we haven't yet talked about. Something oddly modern. See, for a game that's over 1,000 years old, Tafel has a surprisingly busy second life. In the last century, it's been uncovered, revived, reinvented, re-argued, and in some cases, hotly debated on internet forums you've never heard of, but might accidentally wander into at 2 a.m. if you're not careful. Welcome to the curious world of the Tafel Renaissance. It began, as these things often do, with confusion. Remember that botched Latin description of tablet from Linnaeus in the 1700s? That one scrap of half-watched rules written by a botanist who clearly thought he was doing something more important than accurately recording a board game that became the foundation of Tafel's reconstruction. And it was a mess. Historians still argue whether Linnaeus flipped the roles of attackers and defenders. Did he get the winning condition right? Was the king allowed to capture what counts as a corner? You'd think this would be sorted out by now, but no. The academic debates are, if anything, even more intense than they were in the Viking Age. There are now multiple competing Tafel rule sets, each with its own loyal fandom. You've got Fetlar rules developed by a group of enthusiasts from Shetland in the early 2000s. Named after the tiny island of Fetlar, these rules try to balance the game, make it more competitive. The king can't take pieces. He can only win by escaping to a corner. He's also slightly less smug than he used to be. Then you have Copenhagen rules, a later invention aimed at improving tournament fairness. These rules include extra conditions for capturing the king and tweak piece movement to reduce drawish endings where both sides just sit and glare at each other until someone gives up and goes to get a snack. And yes, you guessed it, historians still argue which of these is most authentic. Because here's the thing, Tafel, unlike chess, doesn't have a single global rule set. There's no official federation, no Magnus Carlsen of Tafel. Just dedicated communities scattered across time zones, tweaking things based on old texts, archaeological evidence, and sometimes gut instinct. Want to play Brandub? Great. But are you using the 7-6-7 symmetrical layout with escape corners, or the newer variant with cross-shaped king movement and midline traps? Want to host a tournament? Make sure to specify your rule set in advance. or someone named Wolfskald42 will show up and challenge your entire premise. One quirky modern tidbit: in 2014, the World Tafel Federation was formed. A bold, slightly tongue-in-cheek move by a group of online players who wanted to give the game structure without sucking the joy out of it. Their tournaments are polite, fierce, and gloriously nerdy. Prizes often include hand-carved boards, horn cups, or the enduring respect of 5 extremely strategic strangers. And yes, there's even a virtual Nefatafel Championship, hosted online every year with global entrants. You could log in tomorrow, register under an anonymous Viking name, and face off against someone in Finland who's been practicing openings since you were brushing your teeth this morning. What's amazing is that none of this is commercial. There's no corporation funding Tafel, no billion-dollar industry. It's driven by passion, pure and simple. People are drawn to it not for prize money, but for peace. And honestly, can you blame them? In a world of fast scroll content, endless noise, and the brain frazzle that is modern, everything Tafel offers a stillness. No dice, no power-ups, no wild randomness, just slow, careful moves, just tension wrapped in calm. A few modern players describe it like meditation. You sit down, you inhale, you move, and for a while your world shrinks to 13 squares by 13. Even schools have started experimenting with Tafel. Teachers in Norway and Iceland have used it in history classes, not just to teach Viking culture, but to help students with logic and focus. Some even note a calming effect in classrooms. No shouting, no table flips, just strategic silence. Possibly the first known instance of Vikings promoting mindfulness. And beyond the rules, the tournaments, and the message boards, there's the crafting. Tafel sets today are a kind of artisan niche. Woodworkers make custom boards. Glassblowers shape delicate king pieces with swirling runes. Some artists use driftwood and bone. Others carve pieces from deer antler, echoing Viking Age materials. A few even sell sets made entirely from recycled ocean plastic, giving a modern ecological twist to a 1,000-year-old game. Each one is different. Each one tells a story, and maybe that's why Tafel won't die. It's not just a game, it's a narrative machine. Every match has a rhythm, a plot, a climax, and you're the author. Not bad for a board full of quiet. You're near the end now. Not just of the game, but of this journey through Tafel's curious little kingdom, 12 centuries, give or take of silence and strategy pieces and patience. But there's one final thing we need to visit. Something stranger than the rules and richer than the boards. The myth of Tafel. See, despite all the sagas and archaeological scraps, Tafel leaves behind something more nebulous, a reputation. Not loud, not flashy, just persistent. Like a story told over a campfire that no one quite remembers starting. And here's the odd part, it shows up in fiction more than you'd expect. Not just in Viking-themed novels or the occasional moody historical drama, though yes, there are plenty of those, but across genres. Fantasy, science fiction, literary fiction. Tafel sneaks in as shorthand for ancient wisdom, for patience under pressure, for the kind of slow, high-stakes decision-making that doesn't need lasers or dragons to feel intense. You'll see a character playing a king's escape game in the corner of a smoky inn. You'll catch a glint of carved bone pieces in the middle of a political standoff. And if the author did their research, they'll even mention the asymmetric play, the lopsided odds, the subtle stress of having one precious piece and no backup plan. Tafel becomes a symbol, a way of saying this person thinks long-term. This person sees the trap forming 3 moves ahead. This person survives. Historians still argue whether Tafel's modern revival has been helped or hindered by this romanticizing. On one hand, it brings attention. On the other, it muddies the reality. Because as much as we want to imagine Viking poets quietly musing over a game board between raids, the truth was probably more mixed, a bit of gambling, a bit of showing off, a lot of stubbornness, and possibly some cheating. Yes, let's talk about that. There are no surviving Viking cheat codes, no sagas where someone's caught sneaking a second king onto the board. But given what we do know about Viking behavior, competitive, rowdy, deeply concerned with reputation, it's very likely that Tafel had its share of rules, lawyers, and loophole abusers. Some modern reconstructions include house rules taken from folk memory, things like redoing a move if no one noticed, or swapping a broken piece mid-match and pretending it didn't matter. These aren't official, but they speak to a deeper truth. Tafel was a human game. It wasn't sacred, it wasn't perfect, it was messy and flexible and full of little quirks shaped by the hands that played it. And yet that's part of its charm. It survived not because it was codified, but because it couldn't be pinned down. In a way, it's like oral storytelling. Every teller tweaks it. Every village has its own version, and somehow the shape holds. Even now, if you sit down with a modern Tafel player, odds are they'll say something like, "Well, I play with the king, unable to capture, but some people let him." Or we use the Copenhagen rules, but with the Fettler board. It's like ordering coffee with modifiers. Everyone's got a personal twist. And honestly, that's beautiful. Because Tafel isn't about domination. It's not about memorizing 50 openings or speed playing to win in 8 moves. It's about adaptation. Reading the board. Reading your opponent. Learning the subtle difference between a trap and a test. One player described it as the only game that lets you be both the hunted and the hunter one turn apart. That's not a gameplay mechanic. That's a worldview. And as you near the final sections of this quiet story, maybe you feel it settling in the rhythm. The calm, the click and shift of pieces one by one. It's not about kings and warriors anymore. It's about you. Your mind, your pacing, your patience. Tafel has a way of turning your thoughts inward. Not in a stressful, overthinking way, but in a slow, grounding way. Like walking a labyrinth, or folding a paper boat. Simple, old, purposeful. It's ironic, isn't it? That a game born of raiders and storm-beaten coasts would end up being soothing. And maybe that's the last strange magic of Tafel. It lets you step into another time without noise. No music swells, no dramatic reveals, just quiet resistance. Just strategic calm. You don't win by outpowering, you win by outlasting, by paying attention, by thinking softer. And if that's not the coziest possible Viking message for bedtime, honestly, what is? The board is almost empty now. Just a few pieces left. A scattered defender. The king won square away from the corner. You can feel it, the last move coming. A breath held for over 1,000 years, finally ready to exhale. But let's not rush it. Because if there's one thing Tafel has taught you, it's that endings are rarely loud. They don't come with fanfare or glowing victory screens. They arrive gently. Like the last snowflake settling on a roof or the final turn of a ship toward shore. Let's talk about that moment. The endgame. Tafel has one of the most meditative endgames of any ancient board game. In chess, the end is a hunt. Brutal, direct, check, checkmate, game over. But in Tafel, the end can unfold with eerie quiet. The king inches closer to the edge while the attackers try to form a net. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they almost do. And then one clean move, one final slide across the board. The king escapes. There's no cry of triumph, just silence. You sit back. You let it settle. This is by design. Tafel doesn't reward gloating. It doesn't thrive on smack talk or trashy victory dances. It gives you a result and expects you to live with it. Reflect on it. Replay it in your mind long after the fire has gone out. That's why for some, the real game starts after the last move. You rewind. You ask, where did I go wrong? What if I'd blocked that corner earlier? What if the king had waited one more turn? It's not regret, it's recalibration. You play again. You try again. This is why Tafel pairs so well with sleep. Because like dreams, it doesn't hand you the answer. It nudges. It suggests. It plants questions that bloom hours later when you're lying in the dark and suddenly realize, oh, the double trap at square 7, that's where it all shifted. There's also something strangely reassuring in the way Tafel ends. The king escapes, but the attackers are still there, alive, ready to try again. No one's truly erased from the board, just reset. And in this final section, you're beginning to understand that maybe that's the ultimate lesson here. Everything resets. The snow melts. The ship returns. The board is cleared. The pieces go back in the pouch, clacking softly, like small bones of memory. And tomorrow, or next week, or a century later, someone new will pick up those pieces, set them down on a surface woodstone, a glowing touchscreen. The board will form again. The king will take his place. The attackers will close in. The silence will fall. It's one of the few games in history where the silence is part of the gameplay. You don't speak while playing Tafel. Not really. You gesture. You think. You watch. You wait. The game speaks through movement, through restraint, through that soft internal hum you only hear when your brain shifts out of gear and into glide. That's what this has been. One long, quiet glide across an old Viking map made of lines and patience. And now that we've reached the last square, you can let go of the board. Let the shapes blur. Let the pieces become dust motes and memory. You don't need them anymore. The game's inside you now. But before we fade fully, there's one final detail. Some old boards carved into stone, barely readable, now end with runes that translate roughly as, be still, be sharp, be ready. We don't know if that was meant for the king or the player. Maybe both. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just a good reminder for life itself. So now you lie back quiet, with nothing left to chase. You've walked through centuries tonight across carved grids and firelit halls. You've watched kings try to escape, and defenders stand their ground, and attackers form slow, patient nets. You've seen strategies rise and collapse, and rules bend and shift, and scholars argue over corner squares and glass tokens and the movement of a single silent piece. And somehow, through all of it, you've found calm. Your breath has slowed. Your thoughts have softened. There's a rhythm in your chest now, not a battle drum, but a quiet click, like a piece sliding into place. No need to chase it. It's already there. The world is quieter than it was when we began. The room has dimmed. Even the air feels softer, like the pause between dreams. And in that quiet, you carry with you the shape of a board. 13 squares wide, a king in the middle. Corners like distant stars glowing with possibility. You don't need to play. Not tonight. It's enough just to remember the stillness it brings, the way it teaches patience, the way it rewards breath over brawn and calm over chaos. Let the grid fade now. Let the pieces sleep. You've already won. End of script. Sweet dreams.